In 1973, Loretta Jenkins in Dayton brought home $109 from a week at the phone company and set $10 on the table for Saturday groceries. She bought what would stretch. She bought what would keep. She bought what nobody thought twice about then: eggs with marks still on the shell, cheese wrapped in wax paper, a pie made with something from a can that you would not find the same way now. Supper was plain. Lunches were packed. Company still got coffee and cake. That was ordinary. What counted as ordinary changed, quiet and steady, and some of it vanished so completely you would think folks imagined it. I have 15 of them for you. This came from wages that had to cover everything, from kitchens that managed with no refrigeration once food left home, and from a grocery bill that could still come in under $20 for a week if you watched the meat counter and knew when bread was marked down. People used what stores sold. Stores sold things you would not see put out that way now. At number 9, there is a bright little garnish that sat in lunch boxes on ham plates and beside cottage cheese, and the reason it disappeared has less to do with taste than with the law. At number 13, there is a sweet spread that turned up in pies and pantry cakes, and one company changed a whole category by changing one ingredient. At number 2, there is a fish so common on Friday tables that hardly anybody asked where it came from, though the name on the package told only part of the story. I am telling these the way they were so they do not get lost under modern labels and cleaned up memories. If you mean to keep old kitchen knowledge where people can still find it, subscribe and stay with me. That is the whole job here. I put more of these stories in the Lost American Kitchen, link below. It gathers the dishes, prices, pantry habits, and table talk people forget first. We start at number 15. Some were sold openly, some just sat there. Number 15, red number 2 candy. In the 70s, that dye sat in gumdrops, candy corn, pink frosting, fruit chews, and those bright bakery cookies on cardboard trays. It gave a hard, cheerful red that did not cost much, so bakers and candy companies used it by habit. If your church bought sweets wholesale for the school carnival, some of that color was probably in the boxes. Then the Food and Drug Administration withdrew red number 2 in 1976, and makers either changed the shade, switched dyes, or dropped the item outright. That is why the cherry filling in many old sweets looked one way in a 1974 ad and another way a couple of years later. Mrs. Dombrowski at the A&P in Newark used to mark down the broken candy jars on Saturdays, and children knew which red licorice bites stained your fingertips. Back then, about 25 cents a sack. Today, about $3 for the nearest look-alike. Number 14, raw milk at the counter. In plenty of towns, you could still buy milk that had not been pasteurized, dipped into glass bottles at a small dairy store, or sold from a cooler by the quart. People used it for drinking, for clabbered milk, for cocoa, and for Sunday rice pudding with a skin on top. In the 70s, state pasteurization laws tightened unevenly, and more groceries stopped regular counter sales because permits, bottling rules, and insurance no longer suited a small local dairy. By the end of the decade, in many places, if raw milk was sold at all, it had moved off the ordinary grocery shelf and into farm pickup or limited license sale. Earl Bender brought home 2 cold quarts from a creamery outside Zanesville every Friday until that little place quit bottling and turned to feed and ice. Then around 40 cents a quart. Now, if you can get the licensed kind, expect something near $6. Number 13, tinned game meat, not fancy. Just rabbit, venison, sometimes pheasant, packed in broth in squat cans and set beside the tuna, salmon, and chicken. Folks warmed it for gravy over toast, folded it into noodles, or stretched one can with peas and biscuit dough when payday was still a little off. By the late 70s, that shelf began to disappear. Small regional packers faced federal inspection, labeling, and canning costs that made short runs expensive, while supermarkets gave the space to cheaper poultry and faster-selling soup. So the product was not so much outlawed as priced and merchandised off the ordinary table. My neighbor Celia McVeigh kept 2 cans of rabbit in her basement cupboard for snow days, right beside the sterno and the peaches. The exact quantities for this one are in the Lost American Kitchen collection, linked below. Then you paid about 60 cents a can. Now the few specialty tins run close to $8. Number 12, paraffin-sealed jelly jars. In the 70s, plenty of kitchens still poured hot grape jelly or peach preserves into little glasses, floated melted paraffin on top, and set them on a shelf to cool. That wax cap was ordinary pantry work, especially for small batches after a church canning day or a hot week with too much fruit at once. By the end of the decade, the big home canning books and extension sheets had shifted hard toward boiling water processing and 2-piece metal lids, and paraffin sealing mostly left the mainstream kitchen. Stores followed the same path. Wax was for crafts or freezer cartons, not for pantry jelly. I remember August of 1973, standing at the sink with steam on the window and a blue speckled pan between my elbows. The paraffin set pale and smooth as candle wax before supper dishes were done. Helen Morris always made crabapple jelly that way, 6 ruby glasses in a row on a flour sack towel, then maybe 15 cents for wax in a jar. Now, around $4 for lids, jars, and enough fruit to bother. Number 11, packaged beef sweet for the home baker. It used to sit in the meat case or freezer in waxed cartons, chopped fine for mincemeat, spotted dick if somebody had British kin dumplings, or a pie crust that had a certain short chew to it. It was plain thrift food because sweat was a byproduct and the butcher knew how to trim it. What changed was the market. By the late 70s, supermarkets wanted neat cuts and branded ground beef, not fiddly little packs from the kidney fat, and home baking moved toward vegetable shortening, boxed crust mix, and frozen pies. So sweet did not vanish by law. It was crowded out by merchandising, labor, and changing habits. Mrs. Klein, who lived 3 farms over, asked for sweat every November and wrapped it herself in freezer paper for Christmas mincemeat. In those days, it was about 20 cents for enough for a pie or 2. Today, when you find it trimmed and packed, you are closer to $5. Number 10, glass jars with zinc lids and rubber rings. They were on cellar shelves all over America in the 70s, filled with beans, peaches, tomatoes, and pickled beets, especially in houses that kept old jars going because nobody wastes a good jar. You scalded the ring, tightened the lid, and listened for that little settle as the jar cooled. Then the standard changed. By the late 70s, home canning guides and jar makers had pushed hard toward the 2-piece metal lid because it was simpler to standardize, easier to replace, and what stores actually stocked. Once the rings and zinc tops stopped moving at volume, they faded from farm stores and kitchen drawers. That made the whole method disappear with them. My Aunt Verna still had a crate of blue jars under the basement stairs, dust on the shoulders, and rings hanging from a nail in coffee cans. Then, a replacement ring cost pennies. Now, an old jar with a lid can run $7 or $8 from an antique shelf. Number 9, roadside raw cider. In the 70s, plenty of orchards sold sweet cider straight from the press, cloudy as creek water after rain, poured into wax jugs or glass gallon bottles. You drank it cold with donuts, warmed it for Halloween, or set it in the cellar till it turned sharp enough for cooking. Later on, state retail rules, warning label requirements, and supermarket purchasing standards pushed a great deal of cider into pasteurized or treated batches instead. The roadside barrel did not vanish everywhere, but the ordinary grocery jug changed, and the old unheated kind became harder to buy in regular town stores. The exact quantities for this one are in the Lost American Kitchen collection linked below. Mr. Hanley, over by Chillicothe, sold it from a shed with one bare bulb and a damp floor, and he would wedge a paper sack of Stayman wine saps beside the jug so it would not tip on the ride home. Then, about 60 cents a half gallon. Now, about $5 for the treated kind. Number 8, lid-seamed cans. In the 70s, a lot of pantry food still came in metal cans closed with soldered side seams, especially imported goods and bargain brands, and nobody thought much about it while opening peaches, salmon, tomato puree, or fruit cocktail with a church key or hand crank. By the end of the decade, food packaging rules, import standards, and new can-making machinery push manufacturers toward welded seams and different linings, so the old lead-soldered cans dropped out of ordinary American groceries. You can still find the foods, but not packed that way. In 1973, I braced a can of Kling peaches against the sink and worked the opener slow because the wheel kept slipping. My thumb smelled like pennies afterward, and the juice ran cold over my wrist. Mrs. Petrie down on Route 30 kept canned salmon for croquettes, and she saved the labels in a drawer to compare prices from one winter to the next. Back then, around 39 cents a can. Today, closer to $3. Number 7, paraffin-sealed jam jars. In the 70s, home kitchens still turned out jelly and preserves in reused glasses or squat jars, with melted paraffin poured right over the top to make a white cap you could lift with a spoon handle. Strawberry, peach, grape, crabapple, whatever the yard or market gave you. It sat in the cupboard behind flour and cornmeal, and nobody expected matching lids. Then two-piece metal canning lids took over the market. Jar makers standardized around them, and extension bulletins stopped teaching paraffin sealing as an ordinary method, so the jam did not disappear the way of closing it did. Aunt Velma in Muskingum County made blackberry jam every July in old jelly glasses, and she laid yesterday's newspaper under the cooling row because paraffin drips marked the oilcloth. The jars looked plain, but they opened with one neat crack under the knife tip when January came. Then it ran about 15 cents a jar to put up at home. Now it is nearer $3 when you buy the same sort already made. Number 6, sassafras root beer. In the 70s, people still talked about real sassafras the way they talked about real lard crust, meaning the older taste with a little earth to it. Some families made tea from dug roots, and some bought extract for root beer by the gallon, capped in reused soda bottles, and left to work on the back porch. Commercial makers had already begun changing over because federal rules barred saffrole in food, so what stayed on the shelf was reformulated or imitation sassafras instead. That is why the bottle lasted, but the old flavor shifted. My neighbor Earl Fenwick liked his with vanilla ice cream in a jelly jar after hay baling, And he said you could tell the homemade kind by the foam climbing higher than the rim. Children liked the fizz. Grown people liked the smell when the cap came off. Then, about a dime for a big home brew bottle. Now, about $4 for a specialty version with the old name on it. Number 5, orange soda with brominated vegetable oil. In the 70s, Orange Pop and some lemon lime bottles often carried brominated vegetable oil to keep the citrus flavor from floating up in a pale ring at the neck. You poured it over chipped ice at ball games, took it on picnics, and set a couple of bottles in the creek to cool if the ice chest gave out. Later, manufacturers reformulated and dropped it as labeling fights, state restrictions, and buyer pressure changed the market. So the same bright soda stayed, but the ingredient line did not. Kenny Marsh, who mowed the cemetery in Bremen, bought Orange Pop in returnable glass because he said the cold held longer than in cans, and he would hand one to each boy loading clippings in July. The drink looked cheerful in the sun, almost the color of marigolds. Back then, about 20 cents for a bottle. Today, around $2 for a single one, and more than that if you want it in glass. Number 4, custom locker pork. In the 70s, a lot of families still filled the freezer through a local locker plant after butchering time, buying a half hog or a mixed bundle of chops, hocks, sausage, and bacon cut for a particular household. The paper was white, the pencil marks were blue, and your name sat on every package in a cold room that smelled like sawdust and brine. As federal and state inspection rules tightened and small plants faced higher equipment and labor costs, many custom lockers stopped retail trade or shut their doors, and the old direct half-hog habit shrank with them. The exact quantities for this one are in the Lost American Kitchen collection linked below. In 1975, I stacked our wrapped pork shoulder to shoulder in the chest freezer, and the paper rasped against my apron like dry leaves. My husband Paul knew the cutter by name and trusted his sausage seasoning more than anything from Columbus. Then, roughly 35 cents a pound hanging weight. Now, more like $4 a pound for a comparable butchered cut. Number 3, Kaboom cereal. It was a sweet corn cereal with little oat pieces and colored marshmallows sold in a circus box that children could spot halfway down the aisle. You poured it into a wide bowl, let the milk turn pale pink or green, and ate it fast before the marshmallows went slick. It is no longer sold because the market for heavily sugared character cereals shrank. Chain groceries cut shelf space, and General Mills simplified the line until Kaboom disappeared from regular American shelves in the 2000s. The cereal also changed colors and ingredients as food dyes and preservative formulas were revised over the years, so even the last version was not quite the 70s box people remembered. I remember a July morning in 1973, my youngest standing on a chair in this kitchen, shaking that box so hard the marshmallows rattled like gravel. He spilled milk on the red linoleum, and the clown on the carton stared right at me. Then, roughly 69 cents a box. Now, about $5 for a nostalgic stand-in. Number 2, candy cigarettes. They were little white sugar sticks in paper packs made to look like cigarette cartons, sometimes with a red tip, sometimes with a puff of powdered sugar if you blew through them. Children bought them at drugstores, corner markets, and ball games, and half the point was walking around with the pack folded in a shirt sleeve like a grown man. They are mostly gone because anti-tobacco laws and settlement-era marketing restrictions made that imitation less acceptable to stores and manufacturers, and several states barred sales or required changes in packaging. By the 1990s and after, many makers dropped the cigarette name, switched to candy sticks, or quit making them for the American market altogether. My cousin Earl kept a pack in his lunchbox in Chillicothe in 1977, right beside an orange and a bologna sandwich, and the nuns took them away, even though they were only sugar. Back then, about 10 cents a pack. Now, around $3 for candy sticks if you find them at all. Number 1, blue pike. In the Great Lakes states, it was the fish for Friday supper, close kin to walleye, thinner and a shade bluer on the back, usually dredged in flour or cornmeal and fried crisp with lemon, slaw, and white bread. Markets sold it by the pound, taverns ran it as a plate special, and church halls served it during Lent. You do not buy it now because the commercial fishery collapsed from heavy harvest and dirty water, and state and federal closures in the 1970s finished regular sales. By the early 1980s, blue pike was recognized as gone from the lakes, and what looked similar at the counter was plain walleye or another perch listed under its own name. Frank Szymanski at the Fish House in Port Clinton used to pack it in crushed ice for people heading back to Toledo, and he could clean a whole tub before noon. Then it ran about 90 cents a pound. Now the nearest thing, walleye fillets, will cost you close to $16 a pound. If there is one worth doing tonight, it is frying bread in the drippings after supper. Costs next to nothing. Takes 5 minutes. You get a crisp edge, a soft middle, and a pan wiped nearly clean. That was supper stretched one plate farther, and nobody thought twice about it. In 1973, I stood at the enamel sink with green curtains over the window and a jar of bacon grease beside the stove. I kept the lid crooked so it would not stick. Every bit went in there. You did not throw flavor away when hamburger was getting high. Tell me which one your mother or grandmother actually did, not read about somewhere, did with her own hands, kept grease by the stove, canned meat at home, drank raw milk, ate rabbit your uncle dressed, any of it. Whichever one shows up most in the comments is the one I cover next time. Next time I am doing 30 cheap 10-minute suppers a person living alone can still make from the cupboard. Things I knew in 1968 and still knew in 1977. A can of salmon, a sleeve of crackers, half an onion, rice, noodles, canned tomatoes, and enough sense not to turn on the oven. Subscribe if you want the old ways plainly told, what things cost, who made do, and how supper got on the table anyway. That is all this channel is, The Lost American Kitchen, and I expect you know